The South was always a place that had social rules, manners, everything laid out specifically and defined. This gives you a great place in which to build a story because you have an easy conflict. And of course, Jezebel is the story of a woman who chooses to break social rules.
That dress could cause no end of trouble. Folks are keen to resent you coming to the ball in it.
Well, let them. They're just petty and narrow-minded.
No, ma'am. It's just they got rules and they go by them, same as you and I.
When you go to the South of the Civil War period or the 1850s, you have the opportunity for great physical beauty. Also that embodies a lot of conflicts that have been defined through the presence of the South.
In movies of this period and books about the South during this period, again, everybody behaves in a certain way, in the way that people expect them to behave. It's such a special kind of subculture. It's a world of magnolias and Spanish moss that's different from any other world. And it's also, of course, a doomed world. People's lives are turned upside down because they've been used to a certain rhythm, a certain world that suddenly is destroyed by the Civil War.
Jezebel was a Broadway play. It was not a very successful play. It had about 30 performances in late 1933, and Warner Brothers, as a result, acquired it for very little money.
The original Julie Marsden in the short-running theater version of this was none other than Bette Davis's arch-rival Miriam Hopkins, and when Warner Brothers selected this for a Warner Brothers picture, it was inevitable that the role would go to their starring presence, Bette Davis.
There's correspondence in the Warner files to the effect, and we're talking now, you know, shortly after the play opened, that this might be a good vehicle for Bette Davis. But then it kind of became dormant, and it didn't really have a renaissance until Gone with the Wind.
It's obvious that in order to appreciate Jezebel, one also has to consider the Gone with the Wind phenomenon. Even though this picture came out the year before, it came out after the book, and it's inextricably linked in terms of film history to Gone with the Wind.
People forget that Gone with the Wind was a publishing phenomenon before it became a motion picture phenomenon. And the reason I think Jezebel was made was to take advantage of this powerful interest in the antebellum South.
Well, say it. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking of a woman called Jezebel, who did evil in the sight of God.
Julie Marsden, the leading lady of this film, is a Bette Davis character if there ever was one.
She is so iron-willed, and she is going to have her way.
It's a very appealing character because she's so complex. You know, there's different levels, you know, able to be aggressive, but then at the same time to be yielding. And in most of Bette Davis's roles, actually, she tends to bring to the part what she's going on in her personal life. And Jezebel, it's the same thing. You get the feeling that Bette Davis is trying to make a point about a woman's place in society at that point in time.
This is 1852, Dumpling. 1852, not the Dark Ages. Girls don't have to simp around in white just because they're not married.
When they hear this line, clearly anyone viewing Jezebel in 1938 understood there were two things going on.
She's making the point in 1850s, but she's really talking about 1938, where you're still controlled herself, controlled by the studio bosses.
To understand why Warner Brothers pulled out all the stops in all of the elements for this film, you have to understand that this was a way to placate Bette Davis. Warner Brothers had taken her to court for breaching her contract.
Bette Davis is in the headline news over a lawsuit with her Hollywood employers. Newspapers have made a lot of fuss because she wore the same clothes 3 days running, practically in rags.
Jack had to prove to her that he would, you know, listen to her in terms of types of films, in terms of people that were involved in her films, the craft. And of course, this is one reason why they took a Southern play.
And of course, it was always meant as a Bette Davis vehicle. And she was happy, because this was going to be an expensive picture for Warner Brothers.
You're going to wear those flowers out with fixing and fussing.
Everything's got to be right, Dumplin'. Just right.
Well, I guess everything is. And you most of anything, honey.
And Hal Wallace, who was the executive producer at the time at Warner's, decided that he was going to borrow from Samuel Goldwyn, the independent producer, he was going to borrow William Wyler, who was a very distinguished director.
William Wyler, I think, was one of the great directors in the history of Hollywood. During the time he made Jezebel, was under contract to Samuel Goldwyn. Wyler was his star, his top director.
For him to come over to Warner's and take on this big production, it's a test for him a little bit.
When Wyler got there, he always wanted to be involved in the evolution of the script. And because they have to start, because of Wyler's schedule and the fact that he was on loan, they can't wait until the script is finished. The second half of the script was, it was written, but it was rough. So they decided to start shooting. And Wyler is a little apprehensive now because he's concentrating on shooting, quite obviously. So he writes and he says, I would like to bring in John Huston because I don't have the time to get with the writers. And he said, John Huston knows what I would like. We think alike. And he could act as kind of a middleman and a go-between. And I would feel much more comfortable.
He wanted to make it complex. He didn't want to make it, white and black. Wyler is known for that, the complexity of his characters.
I don't know that I like that, Dillard.
You're not expected to like it. You like it a lot less when it happens.
And you talk mighty like a black abolitionist.
I think it was Voltaire who said, I disagree with everything you say, and I will defend to the death your right to say it.
In Jezebel, there are two types of Southern gentlemen. There's the Buck Cantrell character played by George Brent.
He was of the old South, the antebellum South. He's a relic of the past, and it's sort of appropriate that he's killed off.
9, 10.
Press, the Henry Fonda character, is a different kind of Southern gentleman. He still very much believes in the manners and the kind of way of behaving and the strength of the Southern gentleman kind of individual. But he's much more forward-thinking.
Well, Press Dillard is the new Southerner because he had new ideas of sanitation and how to build a city and how to save New Orleans and ending slavery and all that stuff. He had modern ideas.
New York and Boston are steadily laying in rails to the Northwest. They're tapping the whole trade of that country. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, the whole Great Lakes country, beginning to ship east by rail. And New Orleans is missing the parade.
Jezebel was mostly shot on a Warner studio lawn and also at a ranch in Chatsworth, about 10 miles away from the Burbank lawn. A lot of the exteriors were photographed on standing sets, and the close-ups were shot on those actual locales, so that you have actual night exteriors that were shot of the trip through the bayou to get back to New Orleans.
You can create a lot of atmosphere in a scene like that by pumping in a lot of fog and atmospheric elements that make this feel like you're in the bayous in Louisiana when you're practically in the desert of Burbank.
Wyler actually went slightly over budget, but because he shot a lot of the larger scenes early, he was able to get what he wanted in most of those scenes. He understood the strategy of front-loading the shooting schedule with the more difficult and more expensive scenes. That permitted him to take more time with the intimate scenes in the latter half of the schedule.
In fact, this film fell behind in schedule of nearly 28 days, but he was the kind of guy who wasn't going to be rattled by that. He cared about quality.
The thing that people talk about with respect to Wyler's directorial approach to getting performance is basically he would just tell actors to do it over again.
He wanted to push actors to their limit to get the most honest, basic responses from them as a human being.
He was the guy famous for taking 49 takes or even 86 takes, as opposed to Warner Brothers, which is like, one will be enough, thank you.
What he had was an instinct for what a great performance was. And while he couldn't tell an actor or actress precisely what he wanted from them, he could recognize it when he got it. And that was his real genius.
I put on this white dress for you to help me tell you how humbly I ask you to forgive me.
William Wyler typically worked with cinematographer Greg Toland at Samuel Goldwyn. They did many pictures together. But on this particular film, since he's at Warner Brothers, he's working with one of the Warner Brothers directors of photography, Ernest Haller. He was one of the top directors of photography in Hollywood. He had a long and distinguished career that lasted almost 45 years.
Just as this was a seminal film in Bette Davis's career, this was the seminal film in Ernst Haller's career. It was so incredible, his work, that David O. Selznick will use him for Gone with the Wind. And he will win his Academy Award for Gone with the Wind.
He was the cameraman on both of Bette Davis's Oscar-winning performances, Dangerous and Jezebel.
He continued to photograph her as she was, from many angles, difficult to shoot. Davis had an interesting face that was attractive when viewed from the front or the side, but not as great in profile. Haller managed to shoot her in a way that she found acceptable, and that's why she liked to work with him.
One of the aspects of filmmaking that William Wyler always said that he was uncomfortable with was the close-up. He didn't like close-ups that much, but he uses close-ups of Davis a lot in Jezebel. And they're amazing close-ups in which you get different aspects of her character and how she's feeling at different points.
Wyler obviously had budgetary